With this particular armour, I knew I wanted to add some real detail to the edges. In order to achieve this process, you begin using a step called casing. Now this essentially just means taking a bowl of cold water, a sponge, and wetting down all the pieces of leather before you start doing any carving or stamping. It's quite important that you let the leather almost completely dry so that it takes a nice deep impression into the leather and leaves clean cut lines if you're going to be doing any tooling. Now traditionally, one of the first things that I like to add to my armours is a little detail of a border, and for that I use what's called a stitch groover. Now traditionally that's just used for creating a groove for your sewing thread to lay in and protecting it, but I like the border detail that it leaves, and I find that because you can adjust the width of the stitch groover, you can use all sorts of different stamps to create a really nice bit of detail to the finished piece. It's time to grab your stamps, and there's a whole load of different stamps available out there on the internet. Something that works with your armour, something small, something fine, all sorts of patterns are available just by turning the stamp around, trying different angles. I wanted something simple for this one, so I'm just creating a nice alternating pattern within the border area around each panel. Try to keep that stamp nice and upright and make the hammer blows nice and even, but don't be too afraid of hammering the stamp a couple of times. You want a nice deep impression in the leather, and this is the best way to achieve it. Now on this particular armour, I also wanted to add some texture, so this is another type of stamp that you can buy, and there are again several different patterns, but they just seem to bring the surface of the leather to life. Obviously you're starting off with a very flat layer, but adding texture using one of these texture stamps is really effective, especially once you add dye and colour to them. It really does bring each panel to life. Now it's actually quite important when you're stamping detail to keep the leather still a tiny bit damp, and it also helps when we go on to the next stage, which is staining or dyeing the leather. Now the reason it's quite important to keep the leather a little bit damp when you come to staining or dyeing is it just helps the leather itself absorb the colour at an even level. Now as you watch the video you'll notice that I'm being quite sort of carefree with the way that I apply the stain to the leather, but my particular style, I like to give it that completely worn look. So when I'm doing things like colouring, I always imagine what the leather would have looked like, or the armour would have looked like, if it had been covered in dirt or mud and then it had been wiped off, and essentially the whole look that I'm trying to recreate is one where it's battle worn and dirty and real. Now with this particular design, I used two colours. I used a base colour which was a saddle tan, and I applied this in two different coats and just varied the way that I applied it to the leather, the heaviness and the amount of the stain, and this is what sort of really creates those natural swirls and different tones. And then finally I went back and used a dark brown stain just on the edges. Essentially again it goes back to thinking about what the leather would look like if it got really dirty and then was cleaned. And then when you get later on into the process, towards the end of the process, I'll show you how to add even more tone to the colours. One other thing that you need to remember when staining is to really thoroughly apply the stain or dye to the edge of the leather. Obviously this is the part of the leather that's going to get the most exposed in terms of to dirt and moisture, and it's advisable to give it a good coating. And again, when you come to the sealing process, make sure that you seal all the edges carefully. Leave all the leather panels to dry at least overnight, and then you're ready to go on to the next stage of the build itself. Now for this particular armour, because there was no forming needed, I was able to dye each panel individually. If I was going to be forming the leather, then traditionally, depending on the shape, I would put the leather armour together first and then wet form and then stain or dye the complete piece once it was completely dry. There you go. These are the first initial stages that you want to go through with your armour. I'll see you in part 2.